Okay, Chapter 12, Emotional and Social Development in Adolescence. Oops. Erikson's theory, identity versus role confusion. Okay, as we hopefully remember from Psych 215, Erikson's is a stage theory. Erikson goes over each phase of the developmental process from birth up through old age. And at each phase, at each stage of development, Erikson talks about a central conflict, something that the person needs to develop in order to move on to the next phase of development. And if they successfully acquire that attribute, they move on to the next phase of development with the tools they'll need for their next developmental task. And if not, he talks about a negative outcome of the stage. Erikson based his ideas on Freud's ideas. Remember that Freud had a stage theory that basically believed personality was completely developed in the early years of childhood. Erikson disagreed with that and argued that personality continues to grow and change. We continue to develop throughout our lives. And he called this idea lifespan development. And Erikson's ideas are the ones we accept today in terms of continued lifespan development. A second change Erikson made from Freud's ideas is that he moved the focus that Freud had on the physical, the oral stage, focusing on the mouth, the anal stage, focusing on toilet training, the phallic stage, focusing on sexual organs. Erikson was more interested in psychological and social development. And so he took those early stages that Freud talked about and said, okay, what about these stages, what about this phase of development is associated with our social and emotional development? Let me give you an example. The first phase that Freud talked about was the oral stage, where the baby is focused on sucking, eating, getting pleasure from the mouth. Erikson said, okay, that's the physical side, but what emotional and social thing comes out of that? What does the baby develop from that experience? And so he came up with the idea that this first phase, which Freud called the oral stage, Erikson called trust versus mistrust. So in other words, if a baby is fed and cared for and the baby's needs are met, they develop trust in other people. They begin to believe that other people will be helpful to them and that the world is a safe place. And once they develop trust, they're able to move on to the next phase. Freud called that the anal stage, toilet training. Again, Erikson thought, okay, what does that mean? Toilet training is about independence, about doing things yourself, about having autonomy over your body. So autonomy versus shame and doubt was the second phase. And he did that with each of the phases of childhood. So we have trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt. And then the latency period when Freud said, oh, kids are in school, all they're doing is learning. Erikson said, yeah, they're learning. We call that industry versus inferiority. The idea that I can do things and that I can be industrious and accomplish things. And so at the end of childhood, Erikson says, we're not all done, we're not all finished. This is just the beginning of growth and change in adulthood. And the first step of that is to take all of those, he called them virtues, all of those accomplishments of the early years, trust in other people, a sense of independence, a sense of initiative, being able to start things up for yourself, take charge of things and figure out what you want to do. And industry, accomplishment, figuring out what you're good at. All of these now go into the next phase, which is identity. Figuring out who you are, what you value, what's important to you, and your direction in life. Where do you want to go? And Erickson argues that identity is necessary for everything that comes after. All of your adult responsibilities, which are basically to form a family, relationships, and a career, work, accomplishing things, all of that is based on knowing who you are and what you want and what you're good at and coming up with a plan for your life. So teenagers spend their time emotionally figuring that out. They make commitments to vocation, meaning jobs, relationships, people, their sexual orientation, their identification with ethnic group, as well as ideals and values and things that are important. And in order to do that, Erickson says you can't just come up with that without exploration, without trying new things, without being given the opportunity to figure out what you're good at and what you like. And he calls this resolving an identity crisis. Here he doesn't mean crisis in a bad way, like, oh my God, something's terrible. He means it's a conflict. Am I going to be confused about my role, or am I going to build an identity? And through this crisis, you resolve it through exploration, through getting to know yourself, and you develop a healthy sense of identity. Teens who don't have that opportunity to explore, he says, will have role confusion. They will be confused about their role, their place in the world. They won't have a sense of direction and a definition of themselves. It may mean that their early psychosocial conflicts, meaning trust and autonomy, independence, initiative, etc., were not resolved. It may be because society restricts their choices. For instance, oh, girls can't do that, or boys shouldn't do that. And therefore, they're unprepared for the challenges of adulthood. Okay, part of building identity is building self-concept, your ideas about yourself. You're unifying, you're putting together all your separate traits into more abstract descriptors. What does that mean? It means, okay, I know I like school. I know I like to read. I know I enjoy my math class. Maybe that means I'm studious. I love sports. I'm pretty good at baseball. I like watching sports. I like hanging out with people in the park and getting active and running around. Maybe I'm athletic, right? Those are the abstract descriptors, a big word to describe a whole bunch of separate little traits that you've come to realize are true about you. Sometimes there are contradictory traits that a kid has to, and an adolescent has to figure out. Wow, in some contexts, I feel shy, and in other contexts, I feel talkative and confident. How can I figure that out? What does that mean about me? And gradually, slowly, over the course of adolescence, they combine all of these ideas and traits and thoughts into an organized system. They integrate them, they put them together. Self-esteem. You have a self-concept, an idea about yourself. Self-esteem is, do you like yourself or not? Esteem, liking. Again, self-esteem can grow in adolescence with new dimensions. As you have close friends, you feel good about yourself. If you begin dating and know that you appeal to people, that makes you feel good. If you feel competent on a job or competent in school, that improves your self-esteem. In general, for most kids, self-esteem rises. Most people do okay. At school transitions, self-esteem can get a little shaky temporarily when you go to a new school, from elementary to middle school. It's scary, it's new people, it's new challenges. From elementary school to middle school to high school to college. There can be a little bit of a shakiness in self-esteem, but again, most kids adjust and find their way and feel better about themselves. Parenting style, that authoritative parenting that combines rules and structure so that the kids know what to expect, what's expected of them, with involvement and warmth and communication, this really allows kids to develop good self-esteem. It's the foundation of it. Okay. Researchers looked at Erickson's ideas about identity development and explored what are the different possible outcomes of both identity achievement and role confusion. And a psychologist named James Marcia was one who did some earlier research on this, and others have contributed as well, into identity statuses. Basically, identity status involves exploration, meaning how much effort have you put into trying new things to figure out and explore your identity. And then it requires commitment, saying, yep, this is me. I'm going to commit to this. This is what I like. This is what I'm interested in. Okay, so people who did a lot of exploration and then commit themselves, they have what's called identity achievement. They've figured out an identity. It's one that is realistic, that fits them because they've done good exploration. And these are people who have good self-esteem, good self-concept, and tend to move forward well in life. Now, people who have high exploration but haven't committed yet, Erickson, Marcia, and others have called that the identity moratorium. Not necessarily a bad thing if they're still exploring. The moratorium is a time period where you hold off on making final decisions about your life because you're still figuring it out. And that's healthy, provided it doesn't go on way too long, and provided you're truly doing exploration, you're truly working towards a goal of identity. Low exploration can lead to some problems. Low exploration with high commitment we call identity foreclosure. To foreclose means to close something off too early. When you foreclose on a mortgage, you have to leave the house too early. It's taken away. You're calling in the loan before the planned for end because the person doesn't have enough money to pay it. And so identity foreclosure means I just took other people's expectations of me and decided that's what I would do. Low exploration, high commitment. Sometimes that works fine if you're lucky and you pick a job, pick people to be with that you fit with, that you're comfortable with. Maybe a person who foreclosed their identity could have an okay life. But very, very often, this leads to problems later on as people begin to think, my goodness, is this all there is? Look what I missed out. I never really tried anything else. And so it can lead to problems, particularly later on. It can lead to job unhappiness and relationship unhappiness for many people. Identity diffusion is low exploration, low commitment. I didn't look around and I'm not committing to anything. These are the people who drift along with no direction, no plans, don't really know what they want, hop from relationship to relationship. They're never committing to anything. And these are people who, again, are not successful in work, not successful in relationships. Okay, I'm going to skip over this cognitive style just because I think we've kind of adequately covered the identity statuses without it. You got enough to study. Oops. Okay, factors that affect identity development. Personality. Some people are more open. Some people are more active explorers. Child rearing practices, attachment to parents. Feeling attached to parents, feeling confident gives people the confidence to explore. People who don't feel so confident at home, don't have that sense of trust that we talked about earlier, feel less comfortable moving out and exploring. Peers and friends definitely affect identity development. Your school, your community, your culture, your society, all of that plays a role in figuring out who you are. Okay. Culture and identity. I want to focus in this just on cultural minority adolescents because I think this is an important issue, especially in New York City, Queens being the most international borough of the city. I want to focus on this. Students whose parents are immigrants, students whose families identify closely with a minority culture, number one, they may have a more interdependent view, meaning their culture may focus on family, worrying about what other people want and need, rather than the individualistic view of the broader American culture. Constantly transforming self, a coherent narrative. What in the world does that mean? Well, basically it means that if you're in a cultural minority, you're also getting push and pull from the cultural majority. And so you need to come up with a coherent narrative, meaning a story about yourself, an idea about yourself that holds together, that's coherent. And you may be constantly transforming yourself to fit in into worlds, to fit in with your family and your culture, to fit in with the larger American way of doing things. And that can lead to some conflict for adolescents in particular. And families need support to navigate that. Parents need some help accepting that their kids are going to be drawn to some aspects of the new culture. And kids need to learn not to feel embarrassed if they dress differently or if they have different rules at home, and to value both cultures and feel confident and comfortable in both. Okay, Kohlberg's stages of moral development. Now, as you hopefully read in the chapter, Kohlberg studied moral development by giving people a story to read. He gave them what's called the Heinz dilemma, the story of Heinz. Heinz was a man, not real, this is a story, but it's used because it's what we call an ambiguous situation, a situation that does not have one right answer to it. You could come up with a moral argument for resolving Heinz's problem, his dilemma, in more than one way. And that's why Kohlberg used it. He was interested not in how people answered the question directly about Heinz and what he ought to do in terms of stealing the drug or not stealing the drug. Rather, he was interested in the explanation people gave for why they thought Heinz should either steal the drug that he couldn't afford to buy in order to save his wife, or not steal it because the pharmacist would not give it to him without paying for it and he didn't have the money. Kohlberg based his work on Piaget. So he based his work in Piaget's theory of stages of cognitive development. And we see these three levels here, pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. Those correspond to pre-operational, kids who are very, very small children and do not yet have an understanding of logic and understanding of separation between themselves and other people. The conventional level corresponds to concrete operations, what we talked about earlier, elementary school age kids who need to think about things by seeing them, by touching them, who need to do reasoning based only on what they've already experienced. And then post-conventional, the highest level according to Kohlberg, corresponds to formal operations, to the ability to reason in the abstract, to have your own ideas in your own head, separate from what you've experienced and what other people have told you to do. Now, why would it be important to have abstract reasoning, thinking, making moral decisions based only on your own principles? Kohlberg was worried about that conventional level, about people making moral decisions just based on what other people tell them to do. He looked at a lot of events in history, things where people would harm others in wars, things like slavery here in the United States, things like World War II and concentration camps, a host of other really bad things that have happened in history where people say, well, why did I do those terrible things to my neighbors? I was just doing what everybody else told me to do. I was following the rules. Kohlberg wanted to understand how we could help people to see that if the rules are bad, if what other people are telling you to do, if what authority figures are telling you to do is bad, then you should be able to make your own decisions and stand up against bad rules, bad laws, bad orders. And so that's why he was particularly interested in understanding how can we develop this post-conventional or principled thinking. Okay, so at the pre-conventional level, 1 and 2, very, very young children think this way, and Kohlberg noticed that sometimes adults even think this way. It's all about punishment and obedience. It's all about the outcome. So in other words, it's bad if you get in trouble. Meaning, if you don't get in trouble, it must not have been bad. So what would be a pre-conventional kind of answer to the Heinz dilemma? Well, Heinz shouldn't steal because he'll go to jail. And if he goes to jail, that means stealing is wrong, right? It's not about the stealing, it's about the outcome, the punishment. Heinz would go to jail, therefore stealing is wrong. Or everybody would be mad at Heinz if he let his wife die, so he better get the medicine. Getting it is right only because because he won't get in trouble with other people. The conventional level, the concrete operations level, based on your experiences, is following the rules, following the social order. The law says don't steal, so he can't steal. Or, well, it's clear that in his family, his job as a husband would be to, take care of his family, so that's why he ought to go and take the drug. Right? Conventional. It's what he ought to do. It's his job. It's his rules. It's the law. Not thinking for yourself. At the post-conventional or principled level, you would hear answers like, human life is always more important than property, and so no matter what, he has to take the drug to save his wife. Or, I just don't believe that any person has the right to take another person's belongings, and therefore, even if he really wants it, he has to respect that the drug doesn't belong to him. That would be a post-conventional way of thinking. Okay, later research on Kohlberg's theory. Few people reach the post-conventional morality stage. Sadly, few people move beyond rules and regulations in terms of talking about why they do things. Stages 3 and 4 reflect morally mature reasoning for many, many people. In real life, people often reason below their actual capacity. What does that mean? It means that in most situations, you don't sit and think through these big moral principles. In most situations, following the rules is good enough, and so that's what most people do. If pressed, if someone said, well, okay, those are the rules, but what do you think is really the right thing to do? I want you to think about your own opinion. Most people could move beyond what they said and talk about that higher level reasoning. So we need to think of ways to encourage people to reach that higher level of reasoning more often. A big controversy also came out of Kohlberg's research. Kohlberg argued that rights and justice were very important. So he argued that the most mature reasoning, the post-conventional, people would have to talk about these sort of abstract fairness and justice and rights and principles. And what he found was that men were more likely to talk that way than women. Often women discussed all the different people were involved, how they would feel and what they would think of Heinz, and how they would feel as a result of his actions. And Kohlberg placed that in the conventional phase, in that middle phase, in the less mature phase. And so he argued that maybe women have less moral maturity than men. Carol Gilligan was a student of his and working with him on this project, and she took exception to that, A, being female, and B, believing that that was silly, that there was no evidence that women have less moral development than men. And so she reanalyzed the stories and argued that the reason women are so much more likely to talk about what the other people thought and felt was because women are taught what she called an orientation towards an ethic of care. That women are taught that caregiving is of primary importance, and so ethical principles will revolve around worrying about all of the different thoughts and feelings and opinions of others. So it's not worrying what others think of you, but rather it's trying to think deeply about the morality in the way that women are taught to think. It turns out that men and women can think in either of these ways if they're prompted to do so. Women may stress it more, may talk about people more because of that's how they're taught, but women are perfectly capable to think in the abstract about rights and justice, and men, if they're encouraged to think about the feelings of others, are perfectly capable of doing that. Okay, so how do you get people to think in this more morally sophisticated way? You want to give them situations to think about. You want to raise competing issues. You want to have moral conversations with young people. And you don't just want to lecture to them. You want to force them to think. You want to get them to think things through. What would you do? What do you think is right? What do you think would be the moral principles? What do you think the rules would say to do? What do you think other people would want you to do? And what is your personal choice weighed against community obligations? Your rights against other people's rights. And that's the best way to encourage teens to think like that. Child rearing practices influence good moral reasoning. Caring and supportive families, these discussions of moral concerns lead to better moral development. Going to college helps people think in the abstract better and think deeper about situations and go against peer pressure. Peer interaction, being with other people, helps you learn to make moral decisions, and culture has a big influence on moral reasoning, what's considered right and wrong. Now, there's moral reasoning and then there's moral behavior. You might be able to figure things out, but do you go ahead and do them? Do you behave well? Do you do what you should do? What you know you should do? Okay, the maturity of your moral reasoning is important. The first thing you have to do is figure out the right thing to do. Your emotions. Do you have empathy? Do you have sympathy? Will you feel guilty if you do the wrong thing? Your temperament. If you're a very anxious person, you may not get involved to help somebody. Where if you're a more outgoing person, you might be more willing to do that. Your cultural experiences and beliefs, parenting practices, schooling, and involvement in the community will improve moral behavior, doing the right thing. So what is civic engagement, being involved in the community? Volunteering. It promotes good behavior. It promotes moral maturity. Your family should talk about civic issues, community issues, getting involved in the community. Families should set good examples. If parents don't volunteer, why should their kids? We should talk about it, and schools should offer community service and service learning. Religion. You don't have to be religious to be moral. And sadly, not every religious person is moral. Sometimes people use religion for immoral purposes, but formal religious involvement can be linked to community service, delaying sexual activity, and better behaviors. Formal religious involvement does decline in adolescence. They're less likely to just go along, and if the parents are saying, now we're going to services, to go with the parents. They want to spend time with their friends, but often people who have a foundation in a religion will stick with it or will come back to it later. And again, it is certainly possible without religious training to teach morality, but often people do teach it in the context of religious involvement. Pragmatic, practical approach to morality. This is the argument that rather than worrying about stages, we should use morality as practical tools, and that we may do different things at different times based on the context and based on our own self-interest. Gender intensification. This means that adolescents, as they hit puberty, as sexual characteristics develop, as they start to get interested in dating, they become increasingly aware of gender stereotypes, attitudes, and behavior, and many teens become very intensely focused on being ultra-feminine or ultra-masculine. They don't want to be embarrassed. They don't want to look like they don't fit in, like they're not feminine or not masculine. This is even more common in girls than boys. Girls tend to worry about it more than boys, but boys worry about it too. The influences are social, peer pressure, media, etc., biological, puberty sort of spurring it on, and cognitive thinking. By late adolescence, this begins to decline. People are less worried about being super feminine or super masculine. Parent-child relationships. Kids strive for autonomy, for independence. And this is good. They need self-reliance. They need to be independent decision makers. So sometimes that's hard for parents to give teens more autonomy, and you certainly don't want to completely be hands-off and not involved in their lives, but you do want to give them more freedom to make their own decisions. They need to learn how. Kids also de-idealize their parents, meaning they stop looking at their parents as perfect. And that, again, can be very hard for both parties. It can be disappointing when teens realize, gosh, my parents are wrong sometimes, and sometimes parents don't want to hear teens bringing that up. So authoritative parenting, again, is a good tool. It balances the autonomy with monitoring, and it keeps communication lines open. If there is conflict between parents and adolescents, that's normal. That's okay. Sometimes it means parents have to adjust. Sometimes it means parents just have to, hold the line and keep supervising and keep communicating with kids. Acculturative stress, that's what I was talking about before, where there's a conflict between the parents' culture and American culture. And this is going to raise conflicts. And again, keeping communication open is an important way to make sure that these conflicts don't turn into problems. Okay. Family influences on adolescent adjustment. Obviously, rich families and poor families, parents who work, parents who stay home, parents who are married, parents who are single, parents who are separated, kids grow up fine. All sorts of family structures can lead to healthy, happy, successful adults. It is, of course, easier to parent adolescents when family's financially secure, when the parent's job is secure, and when the parent's relationship is stable. But again, with proper support, kids will turn out fine no matter what the family structure. But if there is conflict at home, if there is instability at home, meaning lots of moving, lots of coming and going of adults, different relationships for the parents, that's rough on kids. Sibling relationships are less intense, less fighting, but also maybe spending less time together. However, most people stay close to their siblings, and if they spend less time together as adolescents, they often drift back together later in life. Adolescent friendships. Kids tend to hang out in groups more than they did when they were young. They still may have best friends, but it moves, for many, many kids, it moves to more of a group model. Friendships stress intimacy, meaning getting closer to people, loyalty, and understanding each other. Younger kids, in other words, tend to have friendships based on who's around, who lives next door, who's in your class. Adolescents want to have more of an adult-style relationship where you understand each other, you're close and loyal. People tend to pick friends who are similar to themselves in terms of educational aspirations, beliefs, identity status, and behavior. So if kids are hanging out with, quote-unquote, a bad crowd, those kids are drawn there for a reason. They're drawn to that behavior. And so rather than just blaming the kids, you really want to look at what's going on in the adolescent's life to be causing negative behaviors. Sex differences in friendships. These tend to persist through life. Again, not everybody follows this stereotyped pattern, but female friendships tend to stress emotional closeness, group concerns, a lot of talking, self-disclosure, meaning, telling things about yourself, and mutual social support. Boys' friendships tend to focus on shared activities, doing things together. And there's more competition sometimes, and perhaps more conflict between boys than girls. Now it says, androgyny is related to increased intimacy for boys. What is androgyny? Androgyny is not the same as transgender, and it's not the same as somebody who's not sure of their sexual preference, orientation, or identification. Androgyny simply means a balance of masculine and feminine characteristics. So what this means is that the less hyper-masculine boys are, the more comfortable they are sharing and having close friendships. Okay, we're going to skip that one. Friendship risks. Like anything, friends are great for people, but there are issues, there are problems that can come up. And I want to talk about this notion of co-rumination, because this is a big problem, particularly for girls and particularly in adolescence, where kids ruminate, go over problems together. Co-rumination, ruminating, going over problems together. So if you get two anxious, angry, or depressed kids, and they share those negative feelings, instead of supporting each other, they could be making each other more depressed. Constant complaining. Oh my God, no one likes us. All those kids are picking on us. And we do it sometimes at work too, right? We co-ruminate. Oh my God, the boss is so difficult. Or at school, oh, the professor's so hard. And sometimes it moves from being supportive to reinforcing negative feelings. There's also another risk is relational aggression. This means that you use friendships to be snipey, to be mean to your friends. And again, sadly, this can happen more with girls, or at least it happens more when girls have a very strong, intense friendship which doesn't last long, and then oh, I don't like you anymore, and now there's aggression, there's sniping on the internet, etc. With boys, the aggression can be physical, but with girls, it's often rumors and spreading gossip. Internet communication. It's easy to be mean on the internet. You're not saying it to the person's face. You do it fast without thinking. You can never take it back, and it's out there permanently, and within minutes, everybody's heard. And so as a result, it's important to teach teens how to behave on the internet, not to use racial and ethnic slurs, obscenities, naked pictures, and not to harass people. And it's important to keep an eye out on the internet activity of younger people. Okay. The benefits of adolescent friendships. We talked about risks. What are the benefits? Helps you build identity, understanding other people. It gives you practice for future intimate relationships. In other words, you're not going to be able to settle down and have a family of your own if you don't know how to be friends with people. It's helpful for managing stress, and it helps people like school better if you have friends there. Okay, cliques and crowds. Cliques are the smaller groups, crowds are the larger groups. The good news about cliques is that you're good friends, you tend to be similar, you share values and attitudes, and they're supportive groups. Of course, the bad news is they can be exclusionary, and you want to make sure that you don't have kids who are longing to get into a clique, not because they like those kids, but simply because those kids are popular. You want to help kids learn to pick friends wisely, and you want to make sure that there isn't kind of mean exclusion going on between them. But cliques are good and supportive, and most kids do have a little group of friends. And then there are the larger crowds, which, are larger groups that get together, usually composed of several smaller groups. And they might be based on a stereotype or a reputation, like the nerd group, the athletes group, the hip-hop group, the goth group, etc. Whatever, is going on at a particular school. Romantic relationships, obviously, with age, kids get more and more interested in dating, and are more likely to start dating. Mixed-sex cliques prepare teenagers for dating. So for younger kids, middle school, certainly they shouldn't be doing one-to-one dating. Mixed-sex cliques, mix of boys and girls, that's a nice way to get started. But they're not alone together. They're supervised, and that's a nice way to get used to dating and get ready for it later and to build social skills in mixed groups. Dating goal, and certainly in early high school too, those mixed groups are terrific. Dating goals change with age. At first it's about fun and peer status, and later it's about finding an actual partner. Okay, dating problems. We've already talked about dating too early. That's a bad idea. We've already talked about problems of drug use because that leads to unprotected sex. They also can be linked together, that people who date very early are at higher risk for delinquent behaviors, getting involved in alcohol and drugs, not being focused on school, and also dating violence. Why is very early dating associated with dating violence? Kids are not mature enough to handle it yet, and so it can lead to abusive relationships. Now, for gay youth, it's very, very difficult to find partners in an environment where there are very, very few gay people and where there's peer harassment or rejection. So in other words, they may be afraid to find other gay students for fear of letting people know that they're gay and being harassed. And so gay youth need a lot of support around dating. Adolescent depression. It is the most common psychological problem among people of all ages. It's not just teens. 15 to 20% have had 1 or 2 episodes of depression. It's more common in girls. It's more common in early maturing girls, possibly because of hormonal fluctuations or possibly because of the stress of maturing early ahead of peers. Heredity is involved in being prone to depression. Some people inherit a greater risk for being prone to depression. If parents are depressed, obviously kids are more likely to be depressed. Learned helplessness. If kids feel like they don't have a lot of control over their lives or their situation, that can lead to depression. Suicide. Now, when we read about adolescent depression and suicide, one thing I want to point out is most adolescents do not get depressed. Again, we said 15 to 20% do, so 80 to 85% do not. And certainly, of those, very few commit suicide. However, the suicide rate does jump in adolescence from childhood, in part because of more autonomy, more independence. They have more time to themselves. They're more likely to be alone, and so it could happen. And there's also slightly higher depression in adolescence than in childhood. Now, what are related factors? Gender. Women, as we said, girls are more prone to depression. However, they are more likely to attempt suicide, but boys are more likely to be, quote-unquote, successful, meaning actually kill themselves, because they tend to use and have access to more lethal methods, especially people who have access to guns. That's the most dangerous. Ethnicity. White people in general are more prone than ethnic minority groups. Family environment and high stress. So a lot of stress at home, a lot of stress in school, a lot of stress anywhere. Sexual orientation. Gay teens are at higher risk of suicide, especially if their family rejects them. Personality. If a teen, it doesn't mean that if you're smart, you're at risk of suicide, but a teen that is both very bright and very withdrawn, or antisocial. So somebody who does not have a lot of social contact could be at higher risk. And if there's a specific negative event that triggers it, failing in school, a death in the family, a breakup of a relationship, a bullying incident at school, they could trigger adolescent suicide. So what do you do? How do you prevent adolescent suicide? You want to attend to the warning signs. What are the warning signs? Talking about death, saying I'd be better off dead, giving your possessions away. Suddenly, a teen who's very withdrawn and very unhappy suddenly saying, you know what, I think everything's going to be okay, don't worry about me anymore. That could be a sign that the teen has made a decision to think about suicide. You need to provide adult and peer support. You need to teach them coping strategies for stress. And you need to remove access to means. You do not want to let teens have access to guns, particularly when they're depressed, pills, etc. Now, in terms of those warning signs, we said attend to the warning signs. Okay, so what do? I noticed the warning signs. The first thing you should do is confront them in a kind way and be very open and direct and say, you've been talking about death. Do you mean to say that you think you'd like to commit suicide? Are you thinking you say you'd be better off dead? What do you mean by that? Are you trying to tell me that you're thinking about killing yourself? You're not going to give them the idea, but you're bringing it out into the open. And if they've hinted around at it, they're hoping you'll ask. And if they say, yes, I'm thinking about it, you say, do you have a plan? How serious is this? Have you thought about how you would do it? Again, you're gauging how serious it is. You're gauging whether it's an emergency. And depending on how they answer, you'll know how quickly you have to act and how much supervision they're going to need. But you want to get them into treatment right away. Delinquency, meaning crime and aggressive behaviors. Early and middle adolescence, more kids get into trouble. It hopefully declines later. Gender, boys are a little more at risk than girls. Lower SES, a little more at risk, but that doesn't mean that rich kids are not getting involved in delinquent behavior. Sometimes the behavior is simply different. A difficult temperament, a kid who does poorly in school, a kid who hangs out with antisocial peers, meaning hangs out with kids who don't get along well with other people, or someone who's rejected by peers. Conflict in the family, conflict and violence in the neighborhood, all of these things increase the risk. Early onset. When behavior begins in childhood, usually what that means is the child has some sort of a biological risk for problem behaviors, and parenting does not help. So in other words, the parents don't handle it well, inept, not doing it correctly. Unfortunately, when you have early onset delinquent behaviors, that's serious. That kid needs a lot of help, and that kid is probably in an environment where they're not getting it. Later onset, when it begins around puberty, kid can get into a lot of trouble, but that tends to be less serious. It tends to be more linked to peer influences or stresses, trying to look cool. And if parents can intervene quickly, it's possible to turn that around. Okay, how do you prevent it? Positive family relationships, good schools, communities with good social conditions, things for kids to do. Therapy, multi-systemic, meaning family therapy, individual therapy, services to the family to address the problems. Those zero tolerance policies are not good. Why are they no good? Because they focus on punishment. They don't focus on prevention. They don't focus on treatment. If all you want to do is get even with someone, then you're not getting to the root cause, and what you're doing is you're creating an adult criminal. But if instead of, zero tolerance, suspensions, and juvenile detention and all that stuff, if you offer treatment, you're going to have a much better outcome.